Hi, everyone. This is Queenie Clem with Queenie's Book Talk and Reviews, and I am your literary ambassador. And today I have on my channel Kimberly Golden. Welcome, Kimberly. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
Fine. Tell us a little about yourself.
Well, I've been writing fiction for as long as I can remember. When I was a kid, I started writing stories that I used to send to my grandparents who
Mhm.
lived in Virginia. And I was growing up in Philadelphia, and I only saw them a few times a year. So for me, this was my way of always keeping in touch with them,
Yeah.
was to
Mhm.
write fun stories and keep them entertained. And I think I knew already then that I wanted to be a writer. I mean, my parents were always saying to me I wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor, but I had zero interest in that. And so every time they kept saying to me, "No, no, no, you want to be a doctor," I was like, "No, I'm going to be a writer." Um, and uh, and so then I I tried to test out different things for a while. Like I studied at a high school that specialized in engineering and science and architecture, just because I thought maybe it was good if I had something sensible I could fall back on. And
Mhm.
I realized that I hated all of that. I mean, I didn't like math. It wasn't so much that I didn't like it, I just didn't understand it. It was like a foreign language for me. And the thing that I was always most fascinated by were words. And so when they gave us the opportunity to take creative writing classes, I just focused on that. Uh, then I started university. I kept taking literature classes in creative writing and entered a ton of different literary contests and everything. Ended up going to grad school to study fiction and creative writing, and realized that that was exactly the right place for me to be.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so since then, I've just been writing. I mean, it's been a bit difficult with trying to get traditionally published when you live overseas, especially in the beginning. When I first moved here to Sweden in 95 and I was trying to get my first book that I'd finished published, nobody, none of the publishers in the States answered me. And even
Oh.
when I went to writing conferences and everything, they would always say to me, "Well, we like the ideas that you have, but people don't want to read about, stories that are set in foreign countries. They only want stories that are set in the States." And I just felt like I knew there was a market out there for what
Mhm.
I was writing. So I just kept writing it. And when it became possible to self-publish, then I just decided to just try it. And that's what I've been doing since then.
Okay. What is your genre?
I write women's fiction and contemporary romance, and most of the time my characters are in interracial relationships, or and the stories are usually set here in Europe, just because for the last 20 odd years that's been where the environment that I've been in, and I feel like it's more interesting writing about what it's like to be a Black woman living in Europe than simply writing about being a Black woman in the US. I think there's enough women already doing that, and
Mhm.
that I
Mhm.
can, this is the area that I have my personal experience with, so I focus on that.
Mhm. Okay, can you talk about you say you self-published? Can you
Hmm.
talk about the process of being self-published and what are the struggles or challenges or
Sure. I think when I first decided to start self-publishing, it was back in I think it was 2011 when I first found out that it was possible to actually do it more easily. I was in a writers group here in Stockholm, and one of the girls in the writers group started talking about how she just purchased a Kindle, and that she was having a hard time finding the stories that she was interested in reading for her
Mhm.
Kindle.
Mhm.
So I asked her what was she interested in, and she said, "Well, the same sort of stories that you usually submit to us for the group to critique." And I thought, well, okay, I got plenty of it, so I'll start
Mhm.
publishing it. And since I'd been in that writers group for, at that point, I'd been in the group for about 5 years, I think. And a lot of the work had already gone through several rounds of critique with them. I decided, okay, I'll look for a freelance editor who can help me and trying and tighten things up enough so that I can actually publish it. And I also knew, since I'd worked as a copywriter and I worked with art directors for my day job, I knew what I liked visually for my covers and everything. And I knew that it was a matter of trying to make sure that you really find a good look that fits your brand.
Mm-hmm.
And so I showed a lot of the images I was interested in to the art directors and graphic designers I worked with, and got their feedback so that I understood that I would have like the best possible looking covers. Because I know that no matter what people say, people will tell you that they only judge the book by the blurb or by a review, but
Mm-hmm.
most people still look at the cover. And if your
Yes.
cover is too busy looking, or if it looks as though it's too sort of homemade or whatever, I know people turn away from it because I see how they are in bookstores. I even if I read a lot of ebooks, I still go to regular brick and mortar bookstores all the time. And I see when there are self-published books that don't have professional looking covers, how a person will look at it, glance at the back, glance at the front again, and already just decide to disregard that book because they think it doesn't look professional.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really important for me to make sure that any book that I give out, whether it's one where I've made the cover myself or if I've paid someone else to make the cover, it needs to be the best possible cover.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also tried to make sure that any story I put out, I mean, of course, the first two that I did were they're super flawed. And I realize now that they probably could have gone through a few more rounds of edits, but I was so excited about getting them out that I just
Mm-hmm.
rushed it. But since then I've learned my lesson, and it's
Yes.
like, take the time, give the story the time it needs to germinate, and make sure you have a really strong idea. And then when you're writing it, don't think that your first draft just needs one extra round. Sometimes you need more than, 6 months to a year to get the story right. I mean, I have a book I'm working on right now that I've been working on for 3 years. And I'm not a fast writer. And I know that a lot of self-published writers say you have to publish fast to keep your readers in interest. But I think that it's better to make sure you can put out the best possible story
Mm-hmm.
than to just keep releasing things quickly. Because yes, of course, I know as a reader, I'm a bit insatiable. I can be like, sometimes I want it now, give it to me.
Yes.
But
Yes.
the thing is, it's better to wait. And if we think back just 5 or 10 years ago, nobody had a problem waiting for their favorite author to publish a book.
Mm-hmm.
And if it took 1 year to 3 years, we didn't care because we thought it was worth it. So why can't we still give authors that time now, rather than
Mm-hmm.
making them feel like they have to rush through everything and put out a story that maybe they haven't even really had enough time to sit and think about, just because they're worried they're going to lose readers. And I used to worry about that. And I think it's been in the last, I guess it's been the last 2 years where I had to sort of slow down because I went through burnout at work, where I just felt I had so much work related stress and I wasn't feeling well. And then I had several people quite close to me who died quite suddenly. And I just realized I couldn't write. So when people were sending me email or messages on social media asking me, where's your next book? Where's your next book? I didn't know what to tell them because I couldn't write. And I realized I have to take this time. I need to take a break. And I can't just write something and force something out to make everyone else happy. It has to be something that I, as an author, feel proud to release. and that feels like it's a story that's worthy of being released. So for me, it's a bit of a long process that I go through, because I spend a lot of time first just thinking about my characters, and then what's their backstory, what is it that they want from life, why do they come together in the first place, why is it important that those two people meet at that particular time. And then I try and sit down and think through that. Usually what I do is I make a really quick outline to make sure that the story makes sense. Then after I've done that, I read through the outline, try to see if there's any holes in the story that need to be filled. Then I add a few more details. And then once I have an outline I feel really satisfied with, I sit down and I start writing it. Usually I just try to write through the story chronologically. I can't always do that. Sometimes the ideas come to me out of order, but then since I use Scrivener to write my story, I can write chunks of the story really easily and move them around, so that if I start writing something that feels like it should be at the end, and then later I realize actually that scene would be better suited to the beginning of the story, I can more easily move it that way, rather than if I was doing it in Word and had to keep track of a lot of Microsoft Word documents. So in that respect, Scrivener is a lifesaver. Then once I've written the whole story, I usually print it out, so I have a hard copy of it, and I just set it aside for sometimes just a few days, sometimes it's a few weeks. Then I read through the whole story. And I don't make any notes in it. I just try to read through it and try to make sure like I feel that the story is compelling enough. If I get that feeling that, yes, okay, this is a good story, then I read through it again, and then I start taking notes. And I start making notes in the margin of, okay, here I need to add this, or, oh, there's something missing here, I need to add more details here, or this scene doesn't make sense, let's take out, let's just delete this scene. And as much as it hurts, sometimes you have to like just completely delete a lot of scenes because you realize they don't work or they don't make sense with the story you're trying to tell. Or sometimes I have a story I'm working on now that I've been sort of working on and off for 2 years, where I realized that the story started at the completely wrong place. So the whole first half of the book I can't even use. So I just decided, instead of deleting it, I took all of those chapters, moved them to another file, because I thought maybe they'll come in handy for something else later. And then after, I've gone through it and I feel like, okay, I've got a good version of this book now, then I usually ask the people in my readers group if I can get at least 5 of them to beta read it for me, to get like immediate feedback. And once I get feedback from them, I start reading through their comments, make adjustments. Then depending on how much, if I feel like I still need more feedback from them, I might send it to them for another round. But usually I feel like, okay, I think it feels good at this point, and then I send it to my editor. And then we do rounds of developmental editing, which is when they go through and help you to sort of see where you might have plot holes and everything. And then we also do some rounds of copy editing, where they're going through and actually checking to make sure that the grammar is correct and that sort of thing. But I usually try to make sure I send them as clean a draft as possible, so we don't have to do that much copy editing. And then after that, when my editor and I feel like we're really satisfied with the story, then it's a matter of making sure I have a good cover, that I've gone ahead and decided if I'm going to just upload it to Kindle first and have like an Amazon exclusive for a while, or if I'm going to go wide, and then try to get people on my newsletter sign-up sheet interested in it.
Mhm.
And now, since it's been a while since I've published anything new, it's always a gamble with when you publish something. You don't know if it's going to be a success or not. But at this point, I've come to this realization that even though I write so that other people will enjoy my stories, I really do follow what Toni Morrison said, which is that you should write the stories that you want to read. So
Mhm.
whatever I'm writing is something that I felt I haven't seen this story before, and it's a story I would like to read, and
Mhm.
it's nice to share it with other people. So I don't necessarily feel the same amount of pressure anymore that I have to produce a certain type of story, um, or that I have to, as I said, publish fast, because I just don't really. I'm not a fast writer, and I never have been a fast writer.
Mhm.
It often does take me about 6 months to get like the idea to where I want it to be, so that I can actually sit down and write it. But I often, I think a lot of people have heard of NaNoWriMo. I use
Mhm.
NaNoWriMo most of the
Mhm.
time to get my first draft done. And that's been a lifesaver for me in so many ways, because the rest of the year, since I'm also freelancing as a copywriter, sometimes my freelance projects get in the way. But I
Mhm.
always try to keep my schedule free in November so that I can actually get a lot of work done for NaNoWriMo. And then at least I know in come December, I have a first draft that I can work with.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think the process of self-publishing, it's in some ways it's not that different from traditional publishing, because you still have to put in the hours. You
Mhm.
still have to work with an editor. You still need to work with a cover designer and so on. But the difference is that when you're self-publishing, you're paying for all of that yourself. So you really need to feel like you have a good team that you're working with, and you need to feel that what you're putting out is the best possible work, because I know that people hold self-published authors to a much higher level of scrutiny than they do traditionally published authors. You
Mhm.
can have a book from a traditional publisher that could be full of mistakes and nobody will say anything about it in the review. But if you're a self-published author and you have a couple of spelling mistakes that somehow slip through, because no book, no matter how good your editor is, it's never going to be 100% accurate.
Yes.
Um, then people will give you a bad review just because maybe there's a typo in your book, or maybe there was a formatting error that you didn't even notice because it wasn't there when you uploaded the ebook version, but somehow it slipped into the print version.
Mhm.
And they
Mhm.
will give you a bad review for that. And they don't think about the fact that, you know, you went through that draft of the book and you didn't pick it up. Your editor didn't pick it up. Your beta readers didn't pick it up. So somewhere along the line, when the book was being formatted digitally, that might be where that error slipped in, but everybody thinks that it was you and they think that you were sloppy.
Mhm.
And that's the really frustrating part of it, because I mean, I've read books. In fact, I'm reading a book now that is a traditionally published book, and I've already found 4 spelling mistakes in it. And I looked at the reviews, because this book has about 200 reviews and nobody's mentioned those spelling mistakes. But I know that if that was a self-published book, people would have jumped on
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
immediately.
Mhm. 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 Now, when did you first realize you wanted to be an author?
uh, oh gosh. I mean, I think already when I was a kid, it was I I uh, I fell in love with reading when I was about 4 or 5 years old.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if it's true, but my mom and my kindergarten teacher claim that I taught myself to read, because neither of them remembers that they had to do much to teach me how to read.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I remember that the very first book that I fell in love with, it was this kid's book called The Ferdinand the Bull, and I took it everywhere with me. And then I kept, whenever people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I either said I wanted to be an artist or an author. And everyone would always say, "Oh, but you won't make much money doing that." And I didn't care.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but I really started focusing more on it. I think it was around the time I started college. I realized then that writing was the thing that gave me the most pleasure, and everything else just sort of paled in comparison. So I just started focusing on what I needed to do to be a writer. And a lot of people said maybe you should study journalism. So I took some journalism classes, and I realized I didn't really want to be a journalist. I wanted to
Mhm.
write fiction. So then I started focusing more on creative writing. And at that time, this was back in the late 80s. So around like 1980, between 1987 and 1989. Back then, there was a magazine called Mademoiselle that had a fiction
Mhm.
contest every year. And
Mhm.
every year from 1987 until they stopped that contest, which was in 91, possibly 92, I sent an entry. And I never won, but I always got feedback. So I felt like that was like perfect for me, because for me, it was more important to get the feedback, to know like what they thought I could do better as a writer than
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
necessarily win. And actually the people who won the contest are still some of my favorite writers today. Um, so I think just being able to read their work was inspiring for me. And
Mhm.
but I knew already then, and that was like freshman year of college already, understanding that what I wanted was to be a writer. And I knew I'm not probably never gonna become rich from this, but it's what I want to do, and I would much rather focus on that than just doing a job that, yeah, it pays the bills, but it doesn't make me happy. And
Yes.
and I have my parents were very sensible people. I had my mother, who is an accountant, and my dad, who'd been in the Marines and was like working as a buyer for a department store and everything. And he was just like, "Oh, but you have to have like a job where you can pay your student loan and blah blah blah." So I
Mhm.
always made sure I could do those things, but still, I knew my heart and soul was writing, and that's what I was focused on.
Mhm. Now, you said earlier that you were a slow writer. So, how
Mhm.
does it take you to write a book?
It depends. It actually depends on the book, because if I think about one of the first novels I wrote, which was Maybe Baby, that one only took 6 months,
Mhm.
and that one, I got the idea for it during the summer. I sat down and I just started jotting notes for it. Then NaNoWriMo started in November. I wrote the whole first draft for NaNoWriMo and took a break from it for about a month. Then I went back to it and started filling in all the places where I felt like there were plot holes and everything, and
Mhm.
trying to
Mhm.
fix some of the inconsistencies. That took me maybe all of January and February. Then uh, two of my writer friends, Zio Axelrod and Nia Forrester, they both read early drafts of it and gave me feedback.
Mhm.
Then I went back and tightened up some things, sent it to my editor. She went through it and helped me tighten it even more. And then I had a finished draft of it within about, I think it took about maybe 6 or 7 months to have a finished draft of it.
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
I just waited a few extra months to release it, just because I knew that at that particular period when I was ready to release it, it was still that period when it's a bit slow, when people aren't buying so many books.
Mhm.
So I just focused on doing some teasers and promo for it,
Mhm.
and releasing little excerpts of it through my website and through Facebook to get some momentum around it. And then I released it, and then it ended up being one of the best-selling books that I've written, and it's the one that I still get tons of people sending me email
Mhm.
Uh, and it's funny because it's like women from different cultures that I wouldn't have expected to react to this story. I've had women from Latvia and Estonia telling me that this story of a Black woman is the story of their life as well. So, when people say that, that white women can't relate to Black women's story, well, I can say that those women in Estonia and in Latvia certainly related to it because
Mhm,
they still keep
mhm.
buying the book and recommending it. And I still get email from them asking me when is the next part of the Maybe series coming out. So that's quite nice. But yeah, I think, the shortest time it's ever taken me to write a book was 3 months, but the longest time is the one I'm working on now, where it's been almost 3 years and I'm still not quite done. But I
Mhm.
work on several projects at the same time. So it could very well be that in between this time of working on one book that is nowhere near done yet, and this other book, which I started like a few months ago, and I feel like I have something that could be done soon,
Mhm.
that the other, one of the books will come out faster than the other. But I just don't bother to rush it anymore because I feel like it's better to give the story the time it needs.
Mhm. What is your work schedule like when you're writing?
Well, it depends on how many freelance projects I have.
Mhm.
But in general, if I think about when it's a pretty calm period for my freelance work, then we can say that if I have a Monday when I don't have any freelance work, then I usually give myself about 2 hours in the morning to either read through what I wrote over the weekend
Mhm.
and make notes, or I just sit down and I set a timer on my phone and I start writing. And then I tell myself that I need to try and get at least 1,000 words in. And then uh, usually that can take sometimes 1.5 hours to 2 hours, depending on if I get distracted. But I always have music on when I'm writing because I like to get into the mood of the project. So I always make a playlist on Spotify that captures the mood, and that usually helps. Then after I've written for about, say, 2 hours, then I take a break because then I feel like I need to clear my mind.
Yeah.
And then I might go to my local cafe or take the subway into downtown Stockholm and just clear my mind by taking a walk and just like being around other people for a while. Then when I come back home after I've had lunch, I'll sit down and I'll write for like another hour or so. And if I feel like I've got enough, then I just print everything out and I sit down and I start reading through it. Um, Sometimes I go ahead and make notes already, but sometimes I just wait until the project is actually done. But I try to make sure I get at least like, say, 3, 4 hours of writing done per day. It doesn't always happen because there's some days when the words just don't come. And I know some people say you should force the words out because you can't wait for the muse. But I think that there are those times when the words aren't going to come no matter what you do. So
Mhm.
it's better to find other things to do. So if I don't really feel like I'm in a writing mood, then I might just read for a while, whether
Mhm.
it's reading something that I've written that needs to be revised or just reading a completely different genre and just reading for pleasure. Because I think as writers, you can tell yourself, yes, write every day, but I think it's also just as important to read every day. And it doesn't matter if it's the same genre that you write or just some other genre that you enjoy reading. And because sometimes I get ideas just from reading the newspaper, and I like to give myself that time every day for whether it's reading a proper newspaper or reading the news online. I always look for stories that kind of pop out at me
Mhm.
because there's always something like. Few years ago, I was reading I saw something about this guy who started a company where he makes uh, their robots that you can use as sex toys. And I thought, that's really interesting. What if you could like take like a robot like that and make it into a proper companion. And that like sparked an idea for a story for me that I've been working on. And I'm not sure when that story is going to come out, but I've been working. Hopefully it'll be done soon. And, it's like, but it's I've been doing a lot of research on it about like what is like artificial, and because it ends up, you start finding out things about what's artificial intelligence and what do we think our lives will be like in the near future, and will life as we know it be exactly the same as it is now, or will we be even more used to technology? Because if we think about the last like 20 or 30 years, it's exploded immensely. Like nobody would have thought of social media being a big part of our lives like 20 years ago. And now it's like, if you're not checking Twitter, or you're not checking Facebook or TikTok or whatever form of social media you like, you kind of feel like, oh my gosh, I feel so empty. When did that happen? But then again, like some of the people that I know, I mean, many of the writers I know, the reason I know them now is because of social media. And how, and without social media, I wouldn't have been able to find as many writers as I have, or as many readers as I have. I think it's a blessing and a curse at the same time, because it's a very easy way to distract yourself, but it's also a very useful tool.
I think you said earlier that you were a freelance copy editor?
Copywriter.
Copywriter. And what is that?
I write the text that goes into catalogs, and also for any sort of print advertising. Also, I can sometimes you could write scripts for the commercials that are on TV. So right now, one of my clients is the Swedish furniture company IKEA. So I'm doing things. I'm writing text that is probably going to be used in the catalog that will be released in August, the new autumn catalog that. And I'm also doing some things that I'm writing text that they're going to use on social media. So pretty soon, if you see anything talking about like a new sofa for IKEA or something like that, it might have been something that I've written.
Oh, okay.
And I used to, I also am writing text for one of my other clients is a cosmetics company. So I write text about the right way to put on liquid lipstick and how to get the perfect, winged eyeliner look. Even though I hate wearing makeup, I'm quite good at describing how to put it on.
Wow,
So that it's the fun part of the job. Like you get product samples, you get to play with them, you learn how to use them, and then you write about them.
Okay. Where do you get your information or ideas for your books?
Oh, it's some of it just pops into my head. Sometimes it's from people watching. Sometimes it's from when I'm watching the news or when I'm reading newspapers or magazines. I mean, inspiration can come from anywhere. So if I think about the story that I had for Maybe Baby, where you have the woman who falls in love with the guy who was just supposed to be a sperm donor. I mean, that idea started off with my friends and I talking about how one of the girls in our group she wanted to have a baby, and but she didn't have a boyfriend at the time. So she was thinking, maybe I should go to a sperm bank. And she started looking into it, and then she changed her mind about it. Well, then while I went down to Copenhagen, which is about an hour's flight from Stockholm. And I was there for the jazz festival, and at the hotel where I was staying, there was this couple sitting in the garden of the hotel talking, and I realized they were having an affair. And I just ended up getting ideas just from listening to the two of them. And she was saying to him, that, I don't know what to do. That she was also admitting to him that she loved him more than she loved the man that she was involved with, but she was afraid of hurting his feelings. And it was really interesting because I think they felt safe having this conversation because they thought they were in a space where nobody understood what they were saying, because they were speaking, she was speaking Swedish, he was speaking Danish. I'm sitting there, I've been living in Sweden for so long, so of course I understood what she was saying, and I could understand most of what he's saying because Danish and Swedish are kind of similar. And I just felt like, wow, okay. And then I thought, I can use some of this, because that's what we do as writers. We eavesdrop on everybody, and anything we hear, we use. Suddenly it belongs to us.
And they probably didn't know that you could speak them languages either.
No, because they probably thought I was just a tourist. They probably thought she doesn't understand us. And then in some ways, that's the beauty of being, you know, a Black woman living in a foreign country, because people talk about everything around you and assume that you're a tourist and you don't know the language. So I get plenty of ideas just from eavesdropping on people.
Okay. What do you do when you are not writing?
When I'm not writing, I like going out for walks. I like traveling. Yeah, I mean, I would probably say traveling is like my one of my biggest passions. I just love going to different places and just experiencing life from a different perspective. And I like when I never want to be one of those people who's always in a big tour group, because I hate that. I feel like they just take you from one place to another, and you never really feel like you see anything authentic. So I just go to, you know, once I fly into a place, I ask them at the hotel for a map. I might ask them to recommend some restaurants or cafes to me, and then I just go out and explore. And I think that's the best way to do it. So, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why, like when people have read the Maybe series, they talk a lot about like, oh, what, you know, the descriptions of Copenhagen, they're so good. And it's because I just walk when I'm there. And I just walk around, find places. I just try to absorb the atmosphere. And I do that anywhere I go, because I just feel like when you're just in a big tour group, you miss out on so much, and you never get a chance to meet the locals. You just meet other tourists. So I think it's one of the things I tell everybody, especially if they're coming over here to Europe. Don't just go to the tourist attractions. Yes, it's nice to see them. Like if you go to Rome, everybody should see the Colosseum and everything. It's like the, you know, of course there's certain things you should see, but walk, you know, don't just follow a group. Go out on your own. Experience that city at your own pace. Find the things that you like. Try the food that, you know, I think that's also something that for me as a writer, you need to be able to engage all your senses, and the best way to, one of the best ways to do that when you're traveling is just to imagine yourself as a local. Listen to the language even if you don't understand it. Try the food even if it doesn't look like what you're used to from home. I think, you know, that there's certain things that I've tried that probably most Americans would just be like, oh my God, I'm not eating that because it doesn't look like what they're used to. But they're missing out on, you know, like I moved here to Sweden. One of the weirdest things I tried was pickled herring. And who would think that pickled fish actually tastes good? But it does. And then when I tell people that, they go, oh God, I would never try that. That's disgusting. But it's like, but you don't know if you don't try it. So I think it's really, for me, it's about going around and collecting experiences. And I think that's one of my favorite things to do when I'm not writing, is collecting experiences and then finding good books to read in nice cafes, because I really love coffee. You know, and I think anybody who's in my readers group, they probably have seen all the memes that I share of like about coffee. And this, in Sweden we have this, you know, when you take your coffee break, it's called fika, and it's the whole thing about fika is you're supposed to disconnect from everything. It's your time to enjoy. And whether it's just enjoying how perfect that cup of coffee is, or if you're having like a bun or a slice of cake or a cookie or whatever, that you enjoy that, you disconnect, you shouldn't look at your phone, you should just like focus on that. If you're having pizza with someone else, you should be focusing on that conversation you're having with them. And there's something that's really nice about that, because when I lived in the States, whenever I took a coffee break, I would only give myself 5 minutes. Whereas here, it's like, I realized like that you can like just unwind and enjoy.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing too. It's just like understanding this, the quality of life that you get from giving yourself that time. So that's the other thing I like to do, is like to give myself those moments of me time, because I think it's important. As a writer and just as a person, you need it.
How many books have you written?
I've written 5 novels, let's see, 4 novellas, and then I have 1 serial that I finished last year that I'm compiling now into 1 novel. So I'm working on adding some bits and pieces to it.
What do you think makes a good story?
You need to have characters who make lots of mistakes. They can't be perfect. I think it was Tolstoy who said that, you know, you can have stories about happy families and that there's plenty of those, but they're not the ones you remember. So it's much better to have a story about somebody who's flawed. And then I think you also need to have a story where it's equally character driven and plot driven. Because I think, like, I've read stories where it's the plot that's just moving everything forward. Like there's all this action, but you never get to know the characters.
Yes.
And for me, those kind of stories, like, yeah, I might remember the action, but I don't remember anything about the characters. And then you have stories that are only about the character, and you almost feel like nothing happens in those stories, and they feel a bit boring. So I think you have to make sure it's a good balance between the two. And then you also have to ask yourself, what is it that you want to say with this story? Are you telling this story because you want to sort of educate your readers into something or open their minds to something, or do you just want to entertain them? So you need to really know what is the purpose of your story. And that was one of the things that I remember learning when I was studying for my master's degree in creative writing, was that my thesis advisor kept saying to us all the time, make sure that when you tell this story that there's a reason you're telling this story, because otherwise it's just fluff. And it might be fun fluff for the person to read, but then they'll forget it, that, you know, after they start the next book. And I always feel like any story that I tell, I want it to be a story that even if as soon as they finish reading my book, the reader moves on to another book, I still want them to remember my characters. And I still want them to remember what happened and feel like they want to know more. So I think if you can create that sort of atmosphere and buzz within your story, so that your reader, even when they read something else that they enjoy, still comes back to you and says, I want to know so much more about that character, then you've got a good book. And then it's up to you if you want to write a series or not. Because I know some readers, they just want series, and some readers just want standalones. I'm sort of on the fence. I like them both, but I do think that the most important thing is that you have interesting characters. There's a real reason for why you're telling the story, and then a really good, compelling story. Because at the end of the day, it's like, if you don't have a good story, people will, just put your book aside.
Okay.
Oh.
How are your characters inspired?
Oh gosh, it's sometimes they just come to me. You know, it's when I was writing Snowbound, which was the first novel that I published, um, I it was just a voice really that came to me. I was sitting there, and suddenly I heard this young woman who was really foolish and a bit of a braggart, talking about how, you know, she was going to steal this man from his wife. And I understood that I wanted her to realize that everything he'd told her was a lie, and that she had to like finally understand that she had sort of played into all of this, and had made a lot of stupid mistakes, because not just because of what he'd said to her, but also because she'd been raised in a household where her mother was also always looking for love, and never really finding it. So she was always just looking for love. And so I just, that story, that character, she was the first character who came to me, Mia. And I just heard her voice. And then I decided then that I wanted to write this story. Um, and I started using Pinterest to make a vision board. And I just started looking for images of women that I thought this could be Mia. And then suddenly I stumbled upon some images of an actress, Sanaa Lathan, who just spoke to me. And I realized that, yes, for me, she's Mia. And so the whole time I was writing that story, I just used her as my inspiration. And it was the same for the South African photographer who ends up popping up in the story as her unwanted tenant at her grandmother's house. I felt like, okay, I knew I wanted to write a story about an interracial relationship. I started looking for images of men who might fit this mold of like a white South African guy. And at first, I wasn't really finding the right character. And then I saw the movie Something New, and I saw the sort of chemistry she had with Simon Baker, who was her co-star. And I realized that actually he looked exactly like what I had been thinking about when I was writing about Jake. So I just started using the two of them as my inspiration for these characters, and it carried me through the whole book. And sometimes it's like that. Sometimes, you know, you just hear a voice. Um, Sometimes you see a picture of someone and that inspires you. Sometimes it could be someone you know who sort of inspires a character. Like there's a few characters in my books that are inspired by people I know. And I've just tried to change some of the, you know, some of the characteristics or some of the mannerisms that they have, just so it's not too close to that person. And so they don't feel like I'm just stealing too many ideas from them. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just, you know, people you meet in passing. Sometimes it's actors. Sometimes it's just completely from your imagination. You just never know. Like for the serial novella that I wrote, Near Enough to Hold, I didn't have any images in my head to start with of the characters. I just knew what their situation was. So I knew that Keisha was a dancer whose career had come to an end because of an injury. And now she was coming back to the States after having lived in London for a while dancing. And she was trying to restart her life. And then I also knew that Nick was going to be this guy who was a bit broken. He'd lost his family in a home invasion that went wrong. And the three guys who broke into his house panicked and killed his wife and his kids. And that was what I knew I wanted to use as the basis, but I didn't know what they looked like until I was halfway through the story. So sometimes it's like that. Sometimes it just sometimes it's all completely in your imagination, and sometimes it's just, you know, you see an actor or you see a model and they kind of inspire you. So it can come from anywhere.
Okay. What's the best way to market your books?
Oh my gosh, I swear, I wish there's so many different ways to market them. I've found lately that sharing information on Instagram about them, uh, especially using Instagram stories, seems to be the best way. Uh, I used to use Facebook a lot for it and do Facebook ads and Amazon ads. But I find that because they keep changing the algorithms for them, it
Mm-hmm.
just gets more and more complicated. Whereas if, especially since I use a lot of visual material, it's easier sharing that and reaching people on Instagram and sometimes on Twitter than necessarily on Facebook. And then a lot of it is word of mouth, because if you write a good story and your readers really like it, they'll tell other people about it. And that's often the best way to find new readers, is to just see if to encourage your readers to write reviews, and to also tell people if they enjoyed your book. So I've had people who've come up to me and said, yeah, I read your book because my friend told me about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really the type of book I usually read, but I really enjoyed it, and I told one of my friends about it. So it's nice, because then you get that chain reaction from that. But I wish I could say that there was like a recipe that was always perfect for marketing, but there isn't, because it changes constantly. I mean, today it's Instagram that works, tomorrow it could be something else.
Do you have family? Do your family support you as an author?
Yeah, I mean, I have like my sister-in-law. She reads my books, and she's always telling her colleagues to read them, and
Mm-hmm.
so and then it's, my husband is very supportive. He doesn't always read like the whole book, but he reads parts of it, and I know he likes my writing style, but he's not really a romance reader.
Mm-hmm.
He likes science fiction more. But he's always super supportive of my work, and it's the same. Like, I mean, my mother, she always says to me, like, oh, I wish you would write more about women who go to church and things like that. But it's her church ladies who buy a lot of my books. So whenever I have a new book out, they all seem to know, and
Mm-hmm.
then and they all buy copies of it. So I think it's like, it's nice that they all get involved and help spread the word.
Mm-hmm. What is your motivation to write?
Oh gosh, if ever since I was younger, if I didn't write, I didn't feel complete. So I felt like I couldn't concentrate. It's the thing that has always given me joy. So for me, it's that joy I get from writing that keeps me writing. And even when it's been difficult to write, I know that once I finish writing that particular thing, that I'm going to feel so good. So it's that reward that I get for the happiness it gives me. Because I don't do it to make a lot of money. I do it because I really love it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where do you see yourself at in 5 years?
Oh, I hope that I have published at least 6 more books by then. Hopefully a few of them have hit the bestsellers list again. Uh, and if I don't have to freelance anymore and I can just focus on writing full time, that would be great. So that's the dream. I mean, I think for all of us who are writers, that's the dream. We want to be able to do this full time,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to support ourselves just from our writing. So if I can get to that point, and also feel like I still have that same joy of writing, I will be very, very happy.
Mm-hmm. Where can readers find you?
They can find me either on Facebook as Kim Golden. They can also find my books on Amazon, and Barnes and Noble and Apple Books, as well as Kobo Books. Otherwise, they can follow me on my website, which is kim-golden.com, and on Twitter as well. So if they look me up on Twitter, if they look for Kimmy GM, KIMI they can find me, or on Instagram as Kim Golden Books. They can find me there.
Is there anything you would like to add before we close?
Well, I hope that everybody who watches this gets interested enough that they want to try reading one of my books. And if they'd like to do that, then I think one of my favorites is this one. It's Maybe Tomorrow. It's part of the Maybe series. It's a standalone book in the series that's about a woman who swears that she's given up on love, who meets a man who swears that he's given up on love as well, on a beach in Copenhagen on Midsummer's Eve. And what happens as the two of them try to deny that they're in love, but they can't seem to stay away from each other. So, and I think it's one of my favorites of all the books I've written. So I think that's the one, like, I think if you want to get a good sense of who I am as a writer, that's the place to start.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming in today, Ms. Kim. I hope you have.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, again, this is Queenie Clem with Queenie's Book Talk and Reviews. Happy reading. Bye, y'all.
Bye.